Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well. My name is Andrés León, and I would like to share a tragic story from my time at university. This happened in 2015. I live in northern Mexico in the state of Tamaulipas. I studied marketing at a university whose name I prefer to omit because it is somewhat well known here in Mexico. However, the campus was on the outskirts of my city, practically out in the countryside. I was fortunate enough to have a car to arrive on time every day. My classes were in the morning, although there were also evening classes for other majors. I had a professor who taught an engineering course. As in different semesters, we had to take courses that were not part of our major. That was how the university was structured. Anyway, that professor usually taught in the afternoon, but during that specific semester, he was going to teach us in the morning. He was very pleasant and always very kind to us, showing great patience and helping us with extra points, as he knew that the subject was not our specialty and that we were practically obliged to take it. He always behaved in a very understanding and professional manner. One evening, when I was already at home doing homework, it was around 8 p.m., when suddenly I saw that a friend from school sent me a message on WhatsApp with a Facebook post. I opened it immediately, and the first thing I saw was my university cordoned off with several soldiers outside standing guard. I began to read the post, which said that a group of trucks from organized crime had forcefully entered the campus because supposedly someone had escaped from them and they thought they had gone to hide there. But that wasn't all. As I continued reading, I felt a pit in my stomach when I reached the part that said a professor from that campus had tried to stop them to protect the students who were in the courtyard. But they took him to an empty classroom, and there took his life, leaving his body lifeless in the classroom. When I read the name, I couldn't help but shed a tear because it was my professor who taught us engineering in the mornings, that dedicated and kind person who, with an impressive vocation, tried to protect his students until the last moment. Those were very sad days. The next day there were no classes, but later they held a tribute at the school where we all attended his funeral. Days passed, and another professor from the evenings began to teach us, but there was an inexplicable void. A few weeks later, two friends and I were sitting at a table near the classroom where the incident had occurred, which, by the way, was locked and no longer in use. It was the classroom at the corner of the entrance to the university. We were there at the end of the school day, planning a surprise party for one of our friends who was about to have a birthday. There were hardly any people left on campus when suddenly we very clearly heard a male cry coming from that classroom. We all fell silent at the same time, looking at each other as if to see if we were all hearing the same thing, and with that silence, we confirmed that indeed someone was crying inside that classroom. One friend started swearing out of shock. My other friend and I said we had to see who it was since the classroom had windows at the top. We were the only ones who dared to go, as my other friend preferred to stay behind. Since I was the tallest, I clasped my hands together for my friend to step on them and quickly peek through the window. We had to find out if someone was in there since the crying was still audible. He climbed up quickly, and the moment his eyes could see through that window, the crying stopped. "There's no one here," he told me. He jumped down, reiterating that there was no one in that room. But I told him to climb back up and check again because I couldn't believe him. He did it again, and this time he stayed longer. But after a while he said, "Andrés, the room is empty. There's no one here." We ran out of there immediately. We knew the crying came from there because the adjacent classrooms were also empty. Classes had ended about half an hour earlier, and hardly anyone was left on campus. We went home very scared and couldn't stop thinking that the one crying was our deceased professor. That night I couldn't sleep. The professor was a very good person, but even so, I felt a lot of fear hearing that cry. The next day, during the break, we were telling a friend what we had heard the previous evening, but she laughed and told us not to make things up and didn't believe us. She even scolded us for playing around with our professor's memory, and we couldn't convince her. But when she left, Mr. Ulysses, who was the school custodian, approached us because he had overheard our conversation, and with a completely serious face told us, In that classroom, you don't just hear things at night. When I stay late to clean, I've seen someone peeking out from that window. I can't see who it is because it's very dark, but I can see the silhouette of a person. I leave immediately because it scares me a lot. I only say a prayer in case it's the deceased professor so that he can leave this world in peace, but I don't dare to get closer to find out who it is. We believed him because he was an older man, a very kind and polite person who never usually talked to us, only greeted us from afar. But he felt the need to share his experience with us. I couldn't help but ask him what other things he heard because I was very curious, and he told us that sometimes when he was cleaning the adjacent classroom, he heard the few desks in that locked classroom being dragged. He would leave immediately because it scared him a lot. He also told us that one night he heard moaning just like we did, but it was doubly eerie because it was already dark, and only the reception staff and he were left on campus, and they were far from that classroom. After telling us all this, he suggested that we keep our professor in our prayers so that he could leave, as he was likely trapped in that classroom due to his terrible end. We thanked Mr. Ulysses for the talk and for trusting us with his experience. At least I followed his advice. Every night before bed, I prayed for my professor and even told my mother to do so as well. Sometime later, we graduated, and the university went bankrupt. After a few years, it is now closed. In fact, I have passed by there when leaving the city, and it is surrounded by tall grass, barely visible. I can't imagine what that place is like at night. Without a doubt, I wouldn't dare go there. Hello community, my name is Regina. I am from Helotepec, state of Mexico, and it is a pleasure to share with you this experience of mine. The story is about something that happened to me many years ago when I was a child. I should mention that this is my first time sharing this anecdote, and I thought of sharing it with you. Hopefully you can share it someday. When I was in elementary school, the teachers used to organize many recreational activities and social events for all the students, and among these activities were the camps. These camps took place inside the school for our safety, and that of the teachers. In one room, all the boys, including the teachers, would sleep, and in other rooms, only girls, including the female teachers, would sleep. I remember that on this occasion, we had to sleep in a room that overlooked some neighboring houses of the school. There was one particular house with a large, grassy area where the owner would let his sheep graze during the day. I liked that room a lot because during the day I enjoyed watching the animals walk and eat. The land looked very clean and green, and there was a small pond on it. The camp went smoothly and quietly throughout the afternoon and part of the night. There were many games and recreational activities, all very healthy and fun. I was exhausted, so I decided to go to sleep with my companions who, like me, were already tired. The teacher in charge of the camp stayed on the field with many students to roast marshmallows and tell horror stories by the campfire. As I mentioned, I went to sleep, but around 2 in the morning I woke up suddenly. I wasn't thirsty, nor did I need to go to the bathroom. I simply woke up. Without fear, I got up and did something I regret to this day, as I saw something that marked my life, something I haven't been able to forget since then. I remember very well that I was very curious to look at the land where the sheep grazed, with the foolish idea that maybe the animals would be there at night too. If not, I could at least see what the place looked like at night. But instead of seeing the sheep, I saw something that left me speechless. What I saw was a man who was staring straight into my eyes with a wide grin from ear to ear. It was quite macabre, to be honest. He was wearing a hat and farmer's clothes, and in his hands he held a stick that was burning in a large bonfire in front of him. I couldn't perceive what he was burning. All I know is that he looked at me in a very disturbing way. I was in shock for a few minutes until a companion saw me standing in front of the window and asked me to accompany her to the bathroom since I was awake. I agreed and accompanied her. I should mention that to reach the bathroom we had to pass by the sides of the field, and on the sides You could see that land where that macabre man was. I thought I wouldn't see him again on the way to the bathroom, but I was wrong. I could still see him. I told my companion what I was seeing, but she didn't want to listen. She said not to try to scare her as she was very frightened and that we should hurry back to bed. Still thinking about what I saw, I even thought for a moment that maybe it was the owner of that land making a bonfire. But that couldn't be possible as it was early morning, and there was no reason for him to be doing that at that hour. I also thought maybe it was the reflection of the teacher and his campfire with the other students, but I looked toward the field, and there was no one there. I went to sleep with that thought in my head, wondering what it could have been that I saw. Perhaps a wandering soul, something evil. I don't know. The only thing I know is that the man was terrifying, very terrifying, and to this day I still remember him vividly. Good evening. My name is Esther Ramirez, and this evening I would like to share with you my paranormal experience. A few years ago, I moved to a new house with my family, consisting of my husband, my 2 daughters, and me. At that time, my younger daughter was just 5 years old, and the older one was already 13. We moved into that house, which I am fortunate not to live in anymore. It was a 2-story house located right in front of a public elementary school. At first, I liked the idea because I told my husband that when our youngest turned 6, we could enroll her in that school, making it easy for us to drop her off and pick her up since we both worked. Him in his office and me as a cook in a restaurant for a few hours while my 2 daughters were at school. I remember very well that first night. The master bedroom was on the 2nd floor and had a large window facing the front, from which we could clearly see the schoolyard. That room was for my husband and me. And of course, my younger daughter also slept in a smaller bed there because she still didn't want to sleep alone or with her sister. That night we went to bed, but around midnight I heard my daughter get out of her bed. So I opened my eyes and saw that she was looking out the window. I asked her what she was looking at because it was time to sleep since she had to go to kindergarten the next day. What she said left me with more questions than answers. "There are kids out there, Mommy. They are playing," she said, pointing her little finger towards the school. I thought she was more asleep than awake and was just babbling, so I got up to take a look myself and put her back to bed. But as I got closer to the window, I heard children laughing. The closer I got, the more my skin crawled. When I looked out, there was no one in that large yard, no one on the street either. It was completely empty, yet the laughter continued. My daughter kept pointing at the schoolyard, telling me to see how the kids were jumping rope. I can't describe the intense chill I felt, so much so that I had to wake up my husband, even though I knew he was very tired. I had to make him aware of the situation, but by the time he was fully awake, the sounds had stopped. Still, I told him what was happening, though I think he didn't fully believe me. I carried my daughter back to her bed and stayed there until she fell asleep. The next morning, I asked my older daughter if she had heard any children laughing outside the previous night, but she said no. She told me that since she went to bed at 10 p.m., she hadn't woken up until morning. She is a heavy sleeper, so she didn't hear anything. The day passed, and at night I couldn't stop looking out the window. The school looked so eerie at that hour because there wasn't much light in the yard. It was dim and empty, very different from how it was during the day, full of children and noise. When it was time to sleep, my husband was the first to fall asleep as usual. My younger daughter also fell asleep quickly since she had played a lot that day. But I took longer to fall asleep that night because I still felt scared from what had happened the night before. Finally, sleep overcame me. I don't remember the exact time, but it was early morning when I heard my little daughter laughing. I woke up and saw that she was again at the window looking out and laughing. I immediately got up and went to her. I swear I saw a small shadow running across the schoolyard, disappearing into the darkness. I asked my daughter what she was looking at, and she replied that a boy was waving at her and making funny faces to make her laugh. I still remember it, and feel the same terror I felt when I heard that. I carried my daughter back to bed and told her not to look out the window anymore, that she needed to sleep because it was very late. But she insisted on staying at the window. I had to persuade her until she fell asleep. That night I stayed awake. It was 4 a.m. and I was still awake, terrified. Then I heard the laughter again, children's laughter. This time I just covered myself from head to toe. I didn't want to get up or look. I didn't dare. The next day, my older daughter told me she had heard children laughing that night, but her window faced the side of the house, so she couldn't see anything. She heard the same thing I did and asked me, scared, who those kids were and why they were outside at 4 a.m. I didn't know what to tell her, so I just said, I didn't know. This went on for several days, and every night it was the same until one day, I ran into a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from mine. She greeted me and asked if we were the ones who had recently moved into that house. I said yes, and introduced myself. She asked how we were getting along. Her question seemed a bit strange to me, but I told her we were fine. She said she was glad because the people who moved into that house never stayed long. I couldn't help but ask why. She asked if we had heard them. I knew exactly what she meant but pretended not to, so I asked her what she was referring to. She said, the children who come out to play in the schoolyard at night. I looked at her without saying anything, and she told me not to worry, that the locals were used to it. Although my house was the only one directly facing the schoolyard, the 2 houses next to ours were unoccupied. I had to tell the lady the truth because I wanted to find out who they were or why this was happening there. She told me one of those stories you hear as a child, about a terrible event that supposedly happened somewhere, and now it's haunted. But her story was real, as I confirmed it myself. She told me that years ago, shortly after the school had opened, there was a gas leak, and one of the classrooms on the ground floor had exploded. It was a first-grade classroom. All the children and their teacher lost their lives. It was said that this was why they came out to play at night, because they were still there. She said this was what everyone said and that she believed it because she also heard them playing at night. But she left it up to me to decide what to believe. Of course, I researched it on the internet and it really had happened. I felt immense sadness for those little ones and the teacher. But it was still hard for me to believe they were the ones appearing at night because I had never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort until it happened to me. Shortly after, we decided to move because my younger daughter kept waking up in the middle of the night to look out the window. It wasn't healthy for her to keep seeing that, so for her sake, we decided to leave. I never imagined something like this would happen to me and my family. You never think you will experience something like that, something unexplainable. But it happened to us, and I really wanted to share our experience because it still disturbs us as much as when it happened. My younger daughter is now 15 years old and remembers nothing of what happened. It's as if that part of her life has been erased from her mind. Anyway, thank you for listening to my story. Good night. Hello everyone. My name is Flor and I want to share with you this paranormal anecdote. It happened to me when I started junior high school, many years ago. But I remember it as if it happened yesterday. It was something that really marked me. I had been in public school my entire life, including the first and second years of middle school. But when I was about to start the 3rd year, my father was offered a very good job, only it was on the other side of the city. So, we had to move house, and I had to change middle school, and my younger brother had to change his elementary school too. Which made me very sad because I already had my best friends in that school, which I remember fondly. Since my father was going to earn very good money, he decided it was time to give us a better education according to his ideas. So, he enrolled both of us in private schools, which was completely new to me. Then the first day of classes arrived and it was very difficult for me because, obviously I didn't know anyone, and it was a completely different environment from what I was used to. It was one of the best middle schools in my city, so the students there were wealthy kids with a lot of money. That first day was a nightmare for me because I tried to make friends, but no one wanted to hang out with me. They saw me as the weirdo, the new girl, so to speak, and even though I tried to start conversations with many of them, they barely responded, and then turned their faces, making it clear they didn't want to talk to me. That day, I ate lunch alone during the break and went home very sad. I didn't want to say anything to my parents because I knew they were very excited to give me a better education, and I also knew they were making a great effort, so I decided to keep quiet, hoping the next day would be better. But it obviously wasn't. That day during the break, I didn't want to eat anything because I didn't like sitting alone in that place surrounded by tables full of boys and girls talking and socializing. I felt like an outcast. So I decided to hide in the bathroom. There were 2 bathrooms at school, one near the tables and another further away, close to the classrooms. So I decided to go to the latter because it was more likely to be empty, which was what I wanted. Simply to be alone and for no one to see me. When I entered, I realized that indeed there was no one there, so I went to the last stall and couldn't help but cry. I felt so melancholic because I missed my friends from the other school and no one here wanted to be with me. But then I heard someone open the door, so I forced myself to stop crying because I didn't want to be heard. I wiped my tears and face with paper, and then left the stall. But as I stepped out, I saw that the person who had entered was an elderly lady. She was sitting by the sink. She kindly introduced herself and told me that she took care of that bathroom, which was new to me because clearly, in my old school, no one watched over the bathrooms. I smiled at her and introduced myself too. I told her I was new, and she replied that she already knew because she had never seen me before. That day I spent the break talking with her. She told me she had been working at that school for many years, but hardly any girls spoke to her, and some didn't even respond to her greeting. I identified with her a lot because I told her that up to that point, no one had talked to me, and that I came from a public school. So we got along very well. For me, it was a great relief to find someone to talk to that day. But then the bell rang, and I had to go back to my classroom, but not without saying goodbye to Mrs. Beatrice. That was her name. That day I returned home a bit calmer because it had made me very happy to talk to that lady, even though I still didn't have friends in my classroom. The next day was the same. My classmates only talked to me about class-related matters, but beyond that, no one wanted to get to know me to become friends. So, I was still in the same situation. Again, during the break I decided to go to that bathroom to talk to Mrs. Betty, as she told me they affectionately called her. She was there, sitting in that chair, greeting me with a big smile like the previous day, and asked if I had made any friends yet. I told her no, but she tried to cheer me up, saying that they were a bit difficult but that in time I would have good friends. Talking to her was very comforting, but something happened that broke that peace. While I was talking to her, some girls entered that bathroom and stared at me while I was talking to Mrs. Betty and then left, mocking me. The lady told me not to mind them, that that's just how they were. But it did affect me. When I returned to the classroom, I noticed that everyone was looking at me, and some were laughing secretly. I knew they were making fun of me. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I told the teacher what was happening, and she immediately stood up and asked everyone aloud what they were laughing at, but no one answered. She insisted until one of the girls who had entered the bathroom while I was talking to Mrs. Betty raised her hand to speak. She said they were laughing because she and her friend had seen me in the bathroom talking to myself. I was too surprised when I heard that and claimed it wasn't true, that I was talking to Mrs. Betty, the lady who takes care of those bathrooms, and that they shouldn't be spreading falsehoods about me. But when I said that, the entire classroom fell silent. The laughter stopped, and only murmurs could be heard. The teacher took me by the shoulder and asked me to come outside the classroom with her for a moment, to which I agreed. She asked me who I was talking to in those bathrooms, and I responded the same way. With Mrs. Betty, the lady who takes care of the bathrooms. She looked at me with complete astonishment and bewilderment. Then she told me something that is still engraved in my mind, in the same tone of voice she used. Mrs. Beatrice passed away a few months ago before the summer vacation. My heart started pounding very hard. I didn't know what to say. My mind went blank. The teacher asked me to describe the lady, and as best as I could, I did. And indeed, it was Mrs. Beatrice. The teacher knew I was new and obviously didn't know the lady, so she knew I wasn't lying. She didn't scold me or say anything else, just asked me to go back to the classroom while she went off somewhere. I imagined to the bathrooms or to report the incident to the assistant principal. I never knew. When I entered the classroom, many girls and boys asked me if it was true that I had seen Mrs. Betty's ghost. They asked with such harshness. I didn't want to answer anyone. I just stayed quiet and ignored them, just like they ignored me. The teacher returned and the class continued as if nothing had happened. But the next day I noticed that those bathrooms were closed. No one could enter them anymore. I stayed at that school for a month and never saw Mrs. Betty again. After that month, I begged my parents to transfer me to another middle school. Although I never told them about Mrs. Betty because they wouldn't believe me, I did tell them that I couldn't make friends and felt very sad at that school. So, they agreed to transfer me to another one. Not the same one I was in before because it was too far away, but another different one where I made friends from the first day. Although what I'm about to say may sound disturbing, I think talking to the spirit of Mrs. Betty was the only positive thing I took away from that school. Sometimes things happen that are hard to believe unless they happen to you firsthand, but that is the reality. Thank you for listening to my story. Good night, everyone.